Chapter 20: Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply. In this chapter, we answer the following questions. What are economic fluctuations? What are their characteristics? How does the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply explain economic fluctuations? Why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward? What shifts the aggregate demand curve? What is the slope of the aggregate supply curve in the short run? In the long run, what shifts the aggregate supply curve? Introduction. Real GDP over the long run in the United States grows at about 3% per year on average. GDP in the short run fluctuates around its trend. Recessions are periods of falling real incomes and rising unemployment. Depressions are severe recessions and they're very rare. 3 facts about economic fluctuations. 1. Economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. 2. Most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. 3. As output falls, unemployment rises. Assumptions of classical economics. The classical dichotomy is the separation of variables into 2 groups: real quantities, relative prices, nominal, measured in terms of money. The neutrality of money. Changes in the money supply affect nominal changes but not real variables. The reality of short-run fluctuations. Classical theory describes the world in the long run but not in the short run. In the short run, changes in nominal variables like the money supply or P can affect real variables like Y or the unemployment rate. We use a new model, the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, with price level on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal output. A downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. The model determines the equilibrium price and equilibrium output. Aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of all goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. Why the aggregate demand curve slope downward? Take the model y equals c plus I plus g. We assume that g is fixed by government policy. To understand the slope of aggregate demand, we must determine how a change in price affects c, I, and nx. G is a given. First, the wealth effect. How does price change consumption? Suppose the price level P declines. There's going to be an increase in the real value of money. Consumers feel wealthier. Increase in consumer spending. Increase in quantity demanded of goods and services. The interest rate effect. How the price affects investment. Suppose the price level P declines. Buying goods and services require fewer dollars. People buy bonds and other assets. There's a decrease in interest rate. There is an increase in spending on investment goods, I. Increase in quantity demanded of goods and services. The exchange rate effect, how price affects net exports. Suppose the US price level P declines, there is a decrease in US interest rate. US dollar depreciates, that means decline in the real value of the dollar in foreign exchange markets. This stimulates US net exports, NX. This will lead to an increase in quantity demanded of goods and services. Why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Summary. An increase in P reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded because of the wealth effect, C falls. Because of the interest rate effect, I falls. Because of the exchange rate effect, NX falls. What is the effect of a stock market boom on aggregate demand? A shift in aggregate demand. A stock market boom makes households feel wealthier, consumption rises, and aggregate demand curve shifts to the right from AD1 to AD2. Any event that changes C, I, G, or net export except a change in price will shift aggregate demand curve. Changes in C is a result of stock market boom or crash, preference reconsumption or savings trade-off, tax hikes or tax cuts. Changes in investment is a result of firms will buy new computers, equipment, factories. Expectations are either optimistic or pessimism. Interest rates, monetary policy, investment tax credit, or other tax incentives. This will change investment. Changes in government, or G, federal spending, for example, defense, state and local spending, for example, roads and schools. Changes in net exports, booms or recessions in countries that buy our exports, appreciation or depreciation resulting from international speculation in foreign exchange markets. The active learning one, the aggregate demand curve. What happens to the AD curve in each of the following scenarios? Number A, a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires. Number B, the US exchange rate falls. Number C, a fall in prices increase the real value of the consumer's wealth. Number D, state government replaces their sales tax with new taxes or interest, dividends, and capital gains. Answers. Number A 10-year-old investment tax credit expires, investment falls, aggregate demand shifts left. Number B, the US exchange rate falls, net export rises, aggregate demand curve shifts right. Number C, a fall in prices increases the real value of consumer wealth. This will be a move down along aggregate demand curve, that is the wealth effect. Number D, state governments replace their sales taxes with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. Consumption rises, aggregate demand shifts right. The aggregate supply curve, AS. The AS curve shows the total quantity of goods and services firms produce and sell at any given price level. AS is upward sloping in the short run, and it is vertical in the long run. Long run aggregate supply is vertical at the natural rate of output, Y sub n. is the amount of output the economy produces when unemployment is at its natural rate, also called potential output or full employment output. Why long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical? Yn is determined by the economy's stock of labor, capital, and natural resources, and on the level of technology. An increase in P does not affect any of these, so it does not affect Yn. That is a classical dichotomy. Example 2, a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. What is the effect of an increase in immigration on the long-run aggregate supply curve? Immigration increases the economy's stock of labor, L, causing Yn to rise. Any event that changes any of the determinants of natural rate of output will shift long-run aggregate supply curve. Why the long-run aggregate supply curve might shift? 1. Changes in labor or natural rate of unemployment. Immigration. Baby boomers retire. Government policies reduce natural rate of unemployment rate. Natural unemployment rate. Changes in capital or human resource. Investment in factories, equipment. More people get college education, college degrees, factories destroyed by a hurricane. This will change capital and human capital. Changes in natural resources, discovery of new mineral deposits, reduction in supply of imported oil, changing weather patterns that affect agricultural production. This will shift the long-run aggregate supply. Changes in technology, productivity improvements from technological progress. Using AD-AS to predict long-run growth and inflation. Over the long run, technological progress shifts long-run aggregate supply to the right, and growth in the money supply shifts aggregate demand to the right. Result, ongoing inflation and growth in output. Short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS curve. The SRAS curve is upward sloping. Over the period of 1 to 2 years, an increase in P from P1 to P2 causes an increase in the quantity of goods and services supplied from Y1 to Y2. Why the slope of SRAS matters? If AS is vertical, fluctuations in aggregate demand do not cause fluctuations in output or employment. If AS slopes upward, then the shift in aggregate demand do affect output and employment. The sticky wage theory, imperfection. Nominal wages are sticky in the short run. They adjust sluggishly due to labor contracts, social norms. Firms and workers set the nominal wage in advance based on price expectations, the price level they expect to prevail. Sticky wage theory 2. If price is greater than expected price, revenue is higher, but labor cost is not. Production is more profitable, so firms increase output and employment. Hence, higher price causes higher output, so the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. Imperfection. Many prices are sticky in the short run due to menu costs, the cost of adjusting prices. Examples: cost of printing new menus, the time required to change price tags. Firms set sticky prices in advance based on price expectations. Suppose the Fed increases the money supply unexpectedly. In the long run, P will rise. In the short run, firms without menu costs can raise their prices immediately. Firms with menu costs wait to raise prices. With relatively low prices, increase demand for their products, increase output and employment. Hence, higher price is associated with higher output. The Misperceptions Theory, imperfection. Firms may confuse changes in price with changes in the relative price of the products they sell. If P rises above PE, a firm sees its price rise before realizing all prices are rising. The firm may believe its relative price is rising and may increase output and employment. So an increase in P can cause an increase in Y, making the short-run aggregate supply curve upward sloping. What do the three theories have in common? In all three theories, Y deviates from Yn when price deviates from PE. So Y is equal to Yn plus A into bracket P minus PE, where Y is quantity of output supplied, Yn is the natural rate of output in the long run, P is actual price level, expected price level is PE. When A is positive or greater than 0, this measures how much Y responds to unexpected changes in price. Y is equal to Yn plus A into bracket P minus PE. Upward sloping short-run aggregate supply, vertical long-run aggregate supply, the expected price level at the equilibrium. When P is greater than PE, Y is greater than Yn. When P is less than PE, then Y is less than Yn. Short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. The imperfections of these theories are temporary over time. Sticky wages and prices become flexible. Misperceptions are corrected. In the long run, PE is equal to P, as AS curve is vertical in the long run. In the long run, PE is equal to P and Y is equal to Yn. And that would be the equilibrium in the long run. Why the short-run aggregate supply might shift. Everything that shifts long-run aggregate supply shifts short-run aggregate supply too. Also, PE shifts short-run aggregate supply. If price expectations rise, workers and firms set higher wages. At each P, production is less profitable. Y falls, short-run aggregate supply shifts left. Long-run equilibrium. In the long run equilibrium, PE is equal to P, Y is equal to Yn, and unemployment is at its natural rate. Analyzing economic fluctuations. 4 steps to analyzing economic fluctuations. 1. Determine whether the event shifts aggregate demand or aggregate supply. 2. Determine whether curve shifts left or right. 3. Use AD-AS diagram to see how the shift changes Y and P in the short run. Number 4, use AD-AS diagram to see how economy moves from new SR equilibrium to new LR equilibrium. Example 3, the effect of a shift in aggregate demand. Use the AD-AS diagram to show the effect of a stock market crash. 1. Affects consumption and aggregate demand curve. Number 2, consumption falls, so aggregate demand shifts left. Number 3, short-run equilibrium is at B, price and output are lower, unemployment is higher. 4, over time, PE falls, short-run aggregate supply shifts right until long-run equilibrium at C, Y, and unemployment back at initial levels. 2 big aggregate demand curve shifts, the Great Depression. From 1929 to 1933, money supply fell 28% due to problems in banking system. Stock prices fell 90%, reducing consumption and investment. Output fell by 26%. Price fell by 22%. Unemployment rate rose from 3 to 25%. 2 big shifts. 2. The World War II boom. From 1939 to 1944, government outlays rose from 9.1 billion to 91.3 billion. Output rose by 90%, price rose by 20%, unemployment fell from 17 to 1%. Active learning 2, working with the model. Draw the AD-AS diagram for the US economy starting in the long-run equilibrium, point A. A boom occurs in Canada. Use your diagram to determine the short-run and long-run effects on US GDP, the price level, and unemployment. The answer: the boom in Canada. Number 1, affects net exports and aggregate demand curve. Number 2, this shifts aggregate demand curve to the right from AD1 to AD2. Short-run equilibrium at point B. Price and output are higher. Unemployment is lower. Over time, price expectations rise. Short-run aggregate supply shifts left from SRA1 to SRAS2, point C. Over time, PE rises, short-run aggregate supply shifts left until long-run equilibrium at C. Y and unemployment are back at initial levels. Case study: the Great Recession of 2008-2009. There was large contractionary shift in aggregate demand. Real GDP fell sharply by 4.2% between the fourth quarter of 2007 and the second quarter of 2009. Employment fell sharply. Unemployment rate rose from 4.4% in May 2007 to 10% in October 2009. The housing market played a central role in this recession. Rising house prices during 2002-2006 due to low interest rates, easier credit for subprime borrowers, government policies to increase home ownership, securitization of mortgages, investment banks purchased mortgages from lenders, created securities backed by those mortgages, sold the securities to banks, insurance companies, and other investors. Mortgage-backed securities perceived as safe since house prices never fall. Consequences of 2006-2009 housing market crash. Millions of homeowners underwater owed more than house was worth. Millions of mortgage defaults and foreclosures. Banks selling foreclosed houses increased surplus and downward price pressures. Housing crash badly damaged the construction industry. 2010 unemployment rate was 20.6% in construction versus 9.6% overall. Mortgage-backed securities became toxic. Heavy losses for institutions that purchased them, widespread failures of banks and other financial institutions, sharply rising unemployment, and falling GDP. The policy response. The Federal Reserve reduced the Fed funds rate target to near zero. Federal Reserve purchased mortgage-backed securities and other private loans. U.S. Treasury injected capital into the banking system to increase banks' liquidity and solvency in hopes of staving off a credit crunch. Fiscal policymakers increased government spending and reduced taxes by $800 billion. Example 4. The effects of a shift in short-run aggregate supply. Use the AD-AS diagram to show the effect of an increase in oil prices. Assume LRAS is constant. 1. Increases costs. Shifts SRAS to SRAS shifts left from 1 to 2. SR equilibrium at point B, price is higher, output is lower, unemployment is higher. From A to B, stagflation, which is a period of falling output and rising prices. What happens in the long run? If policymakers do nothing, low employment causes wages to fall. Short-run aggregate supply shifts right until LR equilibrium is at A. Or policymakers could use fiscal or monetary policy to increase aggregate demand and accommodate the AS shift. Y is back to YN, but P is permanently higher. The 1970s oil shock and their effects. 1973-75, 1978 to 80. 1973-75, real oil prices went up 138%. The CPI went up by 21%. Real GDP went down by 0.7%. Number of unemployed persons increased by 3.5 million. In 1978-79, oil prices increased 99%, CPI increased 26%, real GDP increased 2.9%, and number of unemployed persons went up by 1.4 million. John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946. The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. Keynes argued recessions and depressions can result from inadequate demand. Policymakers should shift aggregate demand. His famous critique of the classical theory. The long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us when the storm is long past, the ocean will be flat. Think, pair, share. You're watching the evening news on television. The news anchor reports that union wage demands are much higher this year because the workers anticipate an increase in the rate of inflation. Your roommate says inflation is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If workers think there are going to be higher prices, they demand higher wages. This increases the cost of production, and firms raise their prices. Expecting higher prices simply causes higher prices. Number A, is this true in the short run? Explain. If policymakers do nothing and allow the economy to adjust to the natural level of unemployment on its own, does expecting higher prices cause higher prices in the long run? Explain. Number C, if policymakers accommodate the adverse supply shock, does the expectation of higher prices cause high prices in the long run? Explain. Chapter in a nutshell. Short-run economic fluctuations around long-run trends are irregular and largely unpredictable. When recessions occur, real GDP and other measures of income, spending, and production fall while unemployment rises. Classical economic theory assumption. Nominal variables such as the money supply and the price level do not influence real variables such as output and employment. Accurate in the long run, but not in the short run. Model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the output of goods and services and the overall level of prices adjusts to balance aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward due to the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. Any event or policy that raises consumption, investment, government purchases, or net exports at a given price level increases aggregate demand. Any event or policy that reduces consumption, investment, government purchases, or net exports at a given price level decreases aggregate demand. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. The quantity of goods and services supplied depends on the economy's labor, capital, natural resources, and technology, but not on the overall level of prices. Three theories explain the upward slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve: sticky wage theory, sticky price theory, misperceptions theory. All three theories imply that output deviates from its natural level when the actual price level deviates from the price level, and that price level that people expected. Shifts of short-run aggregate supply curve, events that alter the economy's ability to produce output. Causes of economic fluctuations, shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply.